Hi, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Adam's Music Box, where today I want to answer a question that I get asked a lot. I'm a Frank Zappa fan, some would say a Frank Zappa fanatic, and as anyone with even a cursory knowledge of Frank Zappa knows, he recorded lots and lots of music and released them on lots and lots of albums in his lifetime. So, which one should you listen to first if you're a Frank Zappa novice, which admittedly is a scary thing to be, because in Zappa's own words, there's no one Frank Zappa sound. There are many Frank Zappa sounds, and if you don't like one, you may like another. I pretty much like all of them, but some I like more than others. So let's look at the best period in Frank Zappa's music, in my opinion. And this is also something that will always divide Zappa fans. I think that Zappa was at his best in the 1980s for many reasons. As Zappa himself said many times, his first band, the original lineup of the Mothers of Invention, was probably his worst band because it formed by accident. These were the musicians in the area that he was living around Lancaster, California, which especially then wasn't really a big metropolis, and even now isn't. It's on the outskirts of the greater LA metropolitan area. And so he worked with what he could get, and all those things considered, they were a good band, mainly because of Frank's compositional and production genius. But as things rolled along, better and better musicians joined the band. And by the 70s and 80s, when the original Mothers were gone from Zappa's life, he really surrounded himself with absolutely top class musicians, some of them who were already known, people like George Duke and Jean Luc Ponty, others who he picked out of relative obscurity, people like Steve Vai, Terry Bozzio, Chad Wackerman, the list goes on. Even Adrian Belew was who we've talked about recently, was fairly unknown when he joined the band, the Underwoods, for instance. So Zappa didn't care if you were 19 and totally inexperienced or if you were someone with an established pedigree. He wanted good musicians in his band, and they had to sing for their supper. If they got lazy, he wouldn't keep you around. And this meant that by 1988, Zappa put together what I believe was his most complete band. It was his largest band that he ever took on tour, and it really was a band that could play anything. Zappa himself loved this band, and for good reason. It was so versatile. There was so much virtuosity, both in terms of the instrumentalist and in terms of the vocalist, which included Ike Willis and Bobby Martin, and it was literally the band that could do no wrong. It had a problem though. They didn't like the bass player. There was an incident on that tour when, in Zappa's words, they all decided to hate Scott Tunis, the bass player, who had been in Zappa's band for a long time by then. And it probably stemmed from the fact that in Zappa's absence, he would have Tunis rehearse the band, and some of the members of the band thought that he was on a bit of a power trip or ego trip, and they didn't like it. This is something that others dispute, but it turned into such a shit show that this 1988 tour with this massive band was cancelled halfway through the tour. So they did the entire European leg and they did half of the US leg, but the second half of the US leg never happened. And this is considered one of the great shames in Zappa's career. But as he explained later on in interviews, when he would be asked about this, he said he spent so much time and so much money rehearsing this band so that they could play hours and hours of music so that the show could be different every night, that to then go back and try to build a new band of that caliber and size, pay for all of the rehearsal time, which would have been a lot of time to learn such a wide variety of songs, it would simply have been impractical. And that was the last tour that Zappa ever did. Now, he, of course, played in public several times more since then and released some more albums since then, but that was the last Frank Zappa tour. He, of course, died a few years later in 1993. Now, getting back to why the albums surrounding that tour is so special has to do with the versatility and virtuosity of that band. There were three albums released based on the material that Zappa recorded on that tour. The first that came out was called Broadway the Hard Way, and that was the shortest and most succinct of the three albums associated with this tour. This album was very political, and it was all about the 1988 election. Zappa was not a fan of Reagan, so he commented on that. They included some of his anti Nixon material from the 70s, namely Dickie's Such an Asshole. It was not only brilliant musically, but it really was sort of like a Broadway show on a single record where it's a concept album made from elements of the live show, the songs that weave this tale about the American political situation in 1988, which some would say is very similar to today, others would say is very different. Next to come out was the double album, The Best Band You Never Heard in Your Life, a reference to the fact that some of the people who bought tickets to that tour weren't able to go because they had tickets for the shows that were canceled. And this album is sort of a mixture of various styles, some of Zappa's more recent songs, a lot of his songs from the 60s and early 70s, a few both classical and rock and roll cover songs done as only Zappa can. And it's, of course, played virtuosically throughout both of those LPs. The final album associated with that tour was primarily instrumental music with quite a bit of improvisation involved, and this was cleverly called Make a Jazz Noise Here. Now, each of these albums are taken out of order from the way it would be played in the show. In his lifetime, Zappa never released an album based on this tour, or any other for that matter, that was just the show played from beginning to end. He would put the songs in the sequence of his choosing from various shows on the tours, and that was the way that Zappa's live albums worked. And such is the case for the three albums based off of this tour. So, although the tour didn't complete all of the scheduled shows, it was a big success in the fact that Zappa got two double albums and a single album worth of material out of these shows, and there were still songs played on the tour that didn't make it onto these albums, which shows you just how much music that band could really play. So, if you want to start with Zappa, I would start with any one of those three live albums, preferably all three. Three is a good number. So if you want three things to listen to from Zappa to introduce you to several of the Frank Zappa sounds, I would start with Broadway the Hard Way, The Best Band You Never Heard in Your Life, and Make a Jazz Noise Here, because the older songs that were played there were played with as much or more virtuosity than they ever have. There's a big mix of the songs that Zappa really liked at that stage in his life when things were pretty good. It was, before he got sick, but after he had become this sort of political figure, this crusader for free speech, at a time when a lot of people didn't like free speech. What might that remind you of? And so it was Zappa's personal and musical zenith, and so was the band. Start with those three records. Now, after that, I would stick with the live stuff, because it was around this time that Zappa also started to edit all sorts of shows that he had done in the past, from the 60s right up to the mid 80s, and he released them on 6 double albums known as You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore. And all of the volumes are available on streaming services now, as are the other albums I mentioned. And these are this is obviously listening to 6 long volumes. It's a lengthy process, but I would say listen to those before you even get into the studio stuff, because again, it's a sample of the various eras of Frank Zappa, the various musical styles, the various musicians that he played with, ranging from the original Mothers all the way up to his highly talented bands of the 1980s. So after you get through the albums based on the 88 tour, I would go volume 1 through 6 of You Can't Do That on Stage Anymore. And then from there, the best thing to do is whichever compositions and songs you like the best, find out where they originally came from. Now, some of those songs were actually never recorded on a studio album, but much of of them were. So find one that you like and then say, okay, I'm going to go back to the studio album from whence it comes and listen to all of that. And before you know it, you'll have heard just about every Zappa album. I would tend to avoid the many posthumous albums released of Frank Zappa for the simple reason that Zappa was quite rightly an artistic control freak. He had a clear vision of what he wanted from his records, and he didn't want anyone mucking about with it or getting in the way. Once he died, that became impossible. So I would stick to both the live and studio albums that he released in his lifetime, and only once you've exhausted those, which might take years for you to thoroughly do, then maybe you can sort of drift into some of the ones that were released after his tragically young death. So that's my advice for a novice journeying into the heart of industrial strength Frank Zappa. Many others will disagree. No one will ever agree, but hey, this is one opinion of the many among fans of the great Frank Zappa. Enjoy your listening, and also know that unlike some live albums, Zappa's live albums were recorded brilliantly. He had his own tape machines at the gigs in almost all the cases after the very early days, at least. He then mixed them all at his utility muffin kitchen, rather, the name of his home studio. They sound really good, better than many artists' studio albums. So if you're thinking this is going to be subpar quality because it's live, well, that's true for most artists. It is not true at all for Frank Zappa. Enjoy, like, subscribe. We will see you next time.